This happened 12 years ago, and there are still nights when I replay that conversation in my head. Not the conversation I had with the police years later, but the one I had with myself on that Tuesday night when I knew something was wrong and decided to stay quiet. I was 19 at the time, working evening shifts at a small grocery store in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't an exciting job, but I knew the customers, knew which old lady always paid with exact change, knew which kids came in after school, and knew the regulars who appeared almost every night. One of them was a man named Aaron. Aaron usually came in shortly before closing. He always bought almost the exact same things: a frozen dinner, a bottle of Coke, and sometimes a packet of chips. He had this terrible habit of making the same joke whenever he reached the counter. He'd look at the receipt and say, "Well, I'm keeping you guys in business." We'd heard it so many times that eventually we'd just smile and wait for him to leave. Looking back, I'd give almost anything to hear that stupid joke again. One Tuesday, Aaron didn't come in. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People miss their routines. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he'd gone somewhere. I finished my shift, went home, and forgot about him. The next morning, the police were outside the store before we even opened. Aaron had been found dead in his apartment. The detectives were speaking to employees and asking whether we'd noticed anything unusual in the days before his death. Most of us had nothing useful to tell them. Then, one detective asked me whether I'd noticed any unfamiliar vehicles in the parking lot the previous evening. I immediately remembered the blue pickup. It had been parked across from the store for nearly an hour before closing. The truck was old, dark blue, and positioned in a way that gave the driver a clear view of the entrance. Whoever was inside hadn't come into the store once. My coworker and I had even joked about it. We'd wondered whether the person was waiting for someone or planning something. The detective asked me if I saw the driver's face. That was the moment everything changed, because I had. It was my older cousin. I wasn't particularly close to him, but I'd known him since I was a child. I'd seen him at family gatherings, birthdays, holidays. I knew his face. I knew the way he sat behind the wheel. I even recognized that old blue truck. There was no real doubt in my mind. But instead of telling the detective that, I said, no, it was too dark. I couldn't see him. The detective thanked me and wrote something in his notebook. Then he left. I told myself I'd done the sensible thing. Maybe my cousin had been there for an innocent reason. Maybe he'd been waiting for someone. Maybe the truck wasn't even his. I didn't want to accuse a member of my own family based on a feeling. A month later, another man was arrested for Aaron's murder. He had a criminal record, and investigators had found circumstantial evidence connecting him to the crime. The case seemed strong enough that people stopped asking questions. I watched the news and told myself I'd been right to stay out of it. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe my cousin had nothing to do with Aaron. Life continued. 3 years passed. Then my cousin died. After his funeral, my aunt began clearing out his garage. She found several boxes that she didn't understand. Inside were newspaper clippings, maps, photographs, handwritten notes, and documents. Every box had a name written on it. One of those names was Aaron's. The police were contacted immediately. What they found inside those boxes changed everything. The investigation into Aaron's murder was reopened. Eventually, DNA evidence connected my cousin to 9 murders committed over nearly a decade. 9 people, 9 families, 9 lives that ended violently. And all those years earlier, I'd seen him sitting in that blue truck. I had been given an opportunity to tell someone. I didn't. A few weeks after the discoveries became public, the detective from Aaron's original case called me. I expected anger. Instead, his voice was strangely calm. He asked me one question. Why didn't you tell us it was him? I sat there, holding the phone, trying to find an answer that didn't make me sound like a coward. I couldn't find one. After a long silence, the detective sighed. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "We think Aaron was his first." For a moment, I felt something horrible. Relief. Because if Aaron had been the first, maybe I hadn't actually caused anything. Then the detective continued. "If we'd known who was sitting in that truck, there's a good chance the others would still be alive." I didn't know what to say. The call ended shortly afterward. It's been 12 years now. I've spent a long time asking myself whether I'm responsible for what happened to those other people. I know I didn't kill them. I know I didn't plan their deaths. I know the person who committed those crimes was my cousin, not me. But every year when the anniversary of Aaron's death comes around, I remember that blue pickup sitting across from the grocery store. I remember the detective asking me if I could identify the driver, and I remember lying. Maybe there's a difference between pulling the trigger and refusing to point at the person holding the gun. I still don't know the answer, but I know one thing. If I could go back to that night, I wouldn't protect my cousin. I would tell the truth. Because sometimes the most frightening thing isn't what we see in the darkness. It's what we choose not to say when the lights are still on. A few years ago, I was walking through a wooded area that most people rarely visited. It wasn't completely wild, but it was far enough from the main trails that you could walk for a long time without seeing another person. I liked going there because it was quiet. There were no cars, no crowds, and almost no sound beyond the wind moving through the trees. One afternoon, I noticed a smell. At first, I couldn't identify it. It was incredibly sweet, almost sickeningly sweet, and completely out of place in the middle of the woods. I stopped walking and looked around, wondering whether there was some kind of plant nearby. The smell was so strong that curiosity got the better of me. I moved toward a patch of thick undergrowth and pulled the branches apart. That's when I saw him. There was a body lying beneath the bushes. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The man had clearly been there for days. The condition of the body was horrifying, and animals had already found him. The sweet smell I'd noticed was coming from the decomposition. I immediately backed away and called the police. They told me to stay where I was and wait for officers to arrive. That sounded simple enough, until the sun began going down. The location was so remote that the police couldn't get there quickly. I remember watching the daylight disappear between the trees while sitting a safe distance from the body. The woods became completely different after dark. During the day, every sound had an explanation: birds, wind, animals moving through leaves. At night, every sound seemed deliberate. A branch snapping somewhere behind me would make me turn around. Leaves moving in the darkness would make me reach for my phone. I kept telling myself that I was being ridiculous. There was a dead man lying several feet away. Of course I was frightened. Eventually, the police arrived and secured the area. They examined the body and began asking questions. Later, I learned that the man had taken his own life. That information should have made things easier. Instead, something about it stayed with me. For weeks afterward, I dreamed about him. The dreams were always different, but he was always there. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of the woods. Sometimes he would sit beside me. Sometimes I would see him exactly as I'd found him, while other times he appeared almost completely normal. But there was always one thing that never changed. He was angry. In the dreams, he would tell me that I had disturbed his final resting place. He would accuse me of dragging him back into a world he deliberately left behind, and eventually he would tell me to join him. The first time it happened, I woke up sweating so badly that my sheets were soaked. I sat upright in bed and looked around the room. Nothing was there. I told myself it was simply my brain processing something traumatic. That's what people tell you when something like this happens. Your brain is trying to make sense of what you saw. It's a nightmare. It's stress. It's grief. It's nothing supernatural. And logically, I agreed. But then the dreams kept coming. Sometimes I would wake up just before he spoke. Sometimes I would wake up hearing the sound of leaves moving outside my window. Once, I woke up convinced that I could smell that same sweet, rotten scent from the woods. That one frightened me more than anything else, because there was no reason for it. I hadn't been back to the woods. There was no smell in the room. Yet, for several seconds, it was so strong that I could barely breathe. Years have passed since I found that body. The nightmares became less frequent, but they never disappeared completely. Every now and then he returns. Sometimes it's only for a few seconds. Sometimes I wake up remembering an entire conversation. And even now, I still occasionally wonder whether those dreams are nothing more than the memories of someone who witnessed something deeply disturbing. That's probably the reasonable explanation. I want it to be, because the alternative is much harder to accept. I don't believe I'd brought anything home from that forest. I don't believe the dead man followed me. But sometimes, when I wake suddenly in the middle of the night, I remember the way he looked in those dreams. Not angry, not violent, just disappointed. As if he knows that I'm still here, and as if he's still waiting for me to finally understand why he was so angry that I found him. A few years ago, I went on a trip with several friends to an old cabin hidden deep in the woods. It was the kind of place that looked perfect during the day. Trees surrounded it on every side, there were no nearby houses, and the nearest road was far enough away that you couldn't hear traffic. We loved it. During the day, we explored the woods, cooked outside, and joked about how isolated the cabin was. We had no neighbors to bother us, no city noise, and no reason to worry about anyone coming near us. That changed at around 3 in the morning. I was lying awake when I heard a knock. Just one. Soft. I assumed one of my friends was messing around. Then it happened again. This time, it came from the window beside me. I sat up. The cabin was completely silent. I listened for a few seconds, expecting another sound. Nothing. I was about to lie back down when there was another knock. From a different window. I quietly woke one of my friends. "Did you hear that?" He listened. A few seconds passed. Then we heard it again. Knock. Knock. This time, it came from the opposite side of the cabin. We woke everyone. At first, nobody took it seriously. Someone suggested it was a branch. Another person thought it might be an animal. But then the knocking moved. One window, then another, then another. It wasn't random. It sounded as if someone was walking around the cabin, stopping at each window one at a time. The strange thing was that the cabin wasn't surrounded by anything tall enough to reach the windows. There were trees, but none close enough to the building. And there were no nearby houses, no roads, no neighbors, nothing. One of my friends grabbed a flashlight. "We should check." Nobody wanted to, but eventually curiosity won. We opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit us immediately. The flashlight beam moved across the trees. Nothing. We walked around the cabin. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no animal tracks, nothing that could explain the knocking. We checked every window. Nothing. Then, from inside the cabin, knock. Everyone froze. We were standing outside. The cabin was empty. Another knock came from an upstairs window. We all looked up. The glass was dark. Then the knocking moved to the window behind us. We turned. Nothing. At that point, nobody wanted to go back inside. But we couldn't stay outside forever. So we returned to the cabin, locked every door, checked every window, and pushed furniture against the doors. Nobody laughed anymore. We stayed together in the main room with the lights on. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., 3 knocks sounded against the front door. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Nobody moved. One of my friends whispered, "Maybe someone needs help." Another immediately shook his head. No. We all knew how far we were from civilization. If someone had actually walked through those woods in the middle of the night, we should have heard them long before they reached the cabin. Then came another 3 knocks, this time from the window. We watched the glass. Nothing was there. One of my friends slowly approached it and looked outside. He immediately stepped back. "What?" He didn't answer. His face had gone completely pale. Finally, he pointed toward the glass. There was condensation on the inside of the window, and in the middle of it were 3 long marks, as if someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. From inside. We moved away from the window. Nobody slept that night. When daylight finally came, we searched the entire property. We found nothing. No footprints, no damaged trees, no evidence that anyone had been there. We left the cabin that morning and never went back. For years, I told myself it had been an animal. Maybe the cabin had strange acoustics. Maybe one of us was half asleep. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But there is one detail I still can't explain. The knocking always came from the outside, until that one moment when we heard it from inside the cabin. And sometimes, when I'm awake at 3 in the morning and hear a noise against my window, I remember that night. I tell myself it's the wind. I tell myself it's a branch. I tell myself there is always a rational explanation. But then I remember those 3 marks on the glass. They were made from the inside. And none of us had been standing anywhere near that window.